The biggest fights that never happened. I feel like the UFC, especially recently, has missed out on so many big fights, either fighters ducking, fights just falling through, injuries, or whatever. They've missed out on so many fights where they could have been massive pay-per-views. It really could have helped the sport grow, and the UFC just missed out on it, either their fault or not. Starting off with the first one, Conor McGregor versus Jorge Masvidal. Masvidal was a massive star 2019, 2020, even 2021. He won the BMF belt against Nate Diaz. Heading into 2020, he was a massive name, but didn't really deserve a title shot, but deserved a really big fight. McGregor didn't deserve a title shot, but he had just made his move to 170, I believe in January 2020, where he faced Cowboy, if I'm not mistaken. They were two of the biggest stars in the sport. They did kind of like a mini face-off after McGregor beat Cerrone, and I feel like this fight would have been so massive. They could have done it for the BMF belt. It was right there. It could have been one of the biggest pay-per-views of all time. It could have really grown the sport. It would have been even bigger than the Poirier fights, but they just missed out on it, partially because of COVID. It was also the UFC's fault. They still could have made it, but Masvidal, he showed up on short notice to face Usman. That kind of brought his stock down a little bit. McGregor, he went back down to 155. He was motivated. They really could have done this fight, but they just missed out, unfortunately. The next fight, Ciryl Adesanya versus Jon Jones. Same time period, really, mainly 2020 during COVID. Again, COVID kind of ruined this. Plus, Jon Jones' performance against Reyes, where he lost, in my opinion, that kind of brought his stock down a little bit. And he decided to take a break. I assume he realized he wasn't really good enough anymore for light heavyweight. But they both had crazy beef, constant trash talk. They both didn't like each other. Adesanya, he was on the rise. Jones was already an established star. And, you know, both of these guys were really big names. Two other names that were super big in the sport. Adesanya, I know it's easy to say Jon Jones would have won by a first round submission. That obviously probably would have happened. But at the time, people were really saying, this was before Izzy moved up. He wanted to move up to 205. People were saying, hey, he could beat Jon Jones. Jon Jones is scared. That's what the narrative was at the time. And even though it wouldn't have been competitive, it would have been a massive fight, and Jon Jones could have got his stock right back up after the Reyes performance. COVID, Jon Jones vacating the belt kind of ruined this, but this was another one that would have been super exciting to watch. Moving on to the next one, Khabib versus GSP. Again, 2020, 2021, COVID was a big year, you know, a big time period for the UFC, Fight Island, and they still missed out on so many big fights. GSP, he said that he would have came back to fight Khabib. He wanted to fight Khabib. Khabib's father wanted Khabib to fight GSP. That was his favorite fighter. Very intriguing fight. I would have loved to see the grappling. Khabib finally moving up to 170. Khabib was a massive name after the McGregor fight, known as a dominant champion, and GSP already established. Again, they missed out. I understand partially it's because Khabib retired. I get why he retired. It's upsetting. It's unfortunate. But this would have been a massive fight. Again, similar time period. 2020 versus and 2021 were great years for the UFC, but it could have been so much better. Similar to 2016, 2017, 2015, around then. Moving on to the next one, Daniel Cormier versus Brock Lesnar. I believe Daniel Cormier, he beat Stipe in the first fight of their trilogy. He got the heavyweight belt. He was the champ. And Lesnar was going to make his return fight. Even though he didn't really deserve it, it was a blockbuster fight. They did a viral face-off that, you know, everyone saw. Brock Lesnar pushing DC, kind of a WWE moment. The wrestling exchanges would have been interesting because even though I do believe Cormier would have definitely won, there was a massive size advantage. You know, Lesnar was a massive heavyweight, and Cormier, he was a small heavyweight. You know, he was a big light heavyweight, but he wasn't a real heavyweight. This would have been a massive fight. Again, I don't know how competitive, but it would have been crazy. I believe this would have happened like 2019, early 2019, right after the McGregor fight when the UFC was super big. The UFC, they missed out again. I believe Brock Lesnar decided to just fully retire, go to WWE. And we did miss out on this fight. Not really the UFC's fault, to be honest. Next up, we have TJ Dillashaw versus Demetrius Johnson. Now, this fight mainly didn't happen, partially because of DJ, but it wasn't really his fault. The UFC, they did not want to pay DJ $1 million, which is what he wanted. You know, he was saying, hey, I'm the undefeated or, you know, undisputed champion. I have so many defenses. This is a pretty big fight. I may be giving up my belt, and you guys are probably going to get rid of the division if I lose. I'm only doing this for $1 million, and the UFC did not want to pay him. Demetrius Johnson also wanted a clause because he didn't believe that TJ Dillashaw would make the weight for 125. And he said, look, if he misses the weight, we have to have a contract where we get a fight for the bantamweight belt instead. You know, even if it's on a few days' notice, we get to do that. The UFC said no again, and DJ said, okay, I'm not doing it. TJ Dillashaw, he wanted to get the second belt. He wanted another belt, or at least a very big title defense. But this ultimately didn't happen because of the UFC. The UFC, they have the money. They should have paid DJ. I know people think I hate Demetrius Johnson because I said he was overrated, but I still have him at like 5 or 6 all time. I just don't think he's 1 or 2. But this is, very unfortunate. The UFC really fumbled this fight. This was a pretty big fight, and it was competitive. I would have loved to see this matchup. Moving on to the next one, Islam Makhachev versus Ilia Topuria. I'm kind of giving up on this fight. I don't think it's going to happen. I think Islam Makhachev, if he wins and beats JDM, he's not doing the weight cut again. He's never going back down to 155. If he loses and Ilia wins, there's a chance, but I don't think he's going to want to fight where he's not the champion. You know what I mean? I think he's like, I'm not the champion in either division. I might as well just stick around at 170. And Ilia, I like him. He's one of my favorite fighters. You could see I have a poster of him, but it's not a guarantee that he beats, Arman Tsarukyan, Charles Oliveira, Justin Gaethje, all these fighters beforehand, before Islam comes back down. And it's a shame because I feel like Ilia is one of the few fighters that could actually knock out Islam Makhachev. I think that outside of JDM, I think these are his 2 hardest matchups. Islam has a lot of tough fights ahead of him. And I think it should have happened. I know people will say, it's just timing, whatever. No, this is the UFC's fault. They should have just done Islam Makhachev, Ilia Topuria in June, and after that fight, Islam can move up for good at 170. He does deserve the, title shot at 170 now, but this is a massive fight. They should have gave him the extra $1 million or something, so he does it. And I get why Islam doesn't want to do it. High risk, little reward, but yeah, this is another fight the UFC messed up on. The matchmaking was awful. Moving on to the next one, Robert Whittaker versus GSP, or even Yoel Romero. This should have happened instead of the Bisping fight. Even the Yoel fight obviously would have been much more interesting. And the UFC fumbled by, having Bisping as champion, giving him an easy title defense. I think, honestly, the reason why they missed out, and maybe it's not missing out, because I believe GSP would have lost to Robert Whittaker. I think his performance against Bisping honestly wasn't the best. He got a great finish. He got, double champ status, but it wasn't dominant, and Bisping wasn't great. Whittaker was obviously a much better fighter than Bisping. I do believe Robert Whittaker would have beat GSP. He was the real underdog. He was the real champ. I would have loved to see this fight. Moving on to another one with GSP. The GSP missed out on the Anderson Silva fight. Now, this is mainly GSP's fault, to be honest. He refused to move up a weight class. He didn't want to take the risk. GSP, he had concerns with Anderson Silva taking PEDs, which I do understand this. I think the weight class thing is stupid, being scared to move up. But the PEDs, it is understandable. I still think he should have just negotiated. He should have, took. And I think he had a legit shot at beating Anderson Silva. I really think he could have won. 2013 was the year to do it, but GSP retired early after really losing the Hendricks fight. He didn't have a great performance, and I get he was taking PEDs. Anderson Silva, I believe, broke his leg and lost, so it just never happened. Very unfortunate. I think if they would have done it in 2012 or instead of the Hendricks fight, it would have been perfect, but unfortunately that didn't happen. Next up, we have Khabib versus Tony Ferguson. This is probably the most infamous example of a massive fight not happening, and this fight was scheduled 5 separate times, and neither guy ended up fighting each other. The first pullout was December 2015, so this went on for nearly 5 years. They were booked to fight, and Khabib ends up pulling out with an injury. I believe Tony stayed on the card. He fought someone else. Then 4 months later, April 2016, Tony Ferguson this time pulls out because I believe it was like a lung issue, something like that. I believe Khabib stayed on the card and fought someone else top ranked. Both guys won, continued to go up the rankings. A year later, March 2017, Khabib has a horrible weight cut and ends up pulling out of the fight, leaving again a 3rd cancellation. And then the 4th time the fight was signed, April 2018. Tony Ferguson trips on a cable backstage and has to pull out of the fight. I believe Khabib was supposed to fight Max Holloway at this time, and then he ended up fighting Aquinta for I believe the vacant lightweight title, which right after was the McGregor fight. This also was like the dolly incident where McGregor went backstage or whatever, threw the dolly at the bus, and then 6 months later or so, the biggest fight in the UFC, McGregor versus Khabib, ends up happening. So maybe it was a good thing that this ended up happening, because if Tony would have won, we would have never got Khabib versus Conor, which helped the sport so much. And then April 2020, this may have been the unluckiest one. The UFC shuts down because of COVID. Now, I believe March 2020 is when it started, and we had Yoel versus Adesanya, which was the last fight that happened before the UFC and everything got shut down, which is so unfortunate. It was such a waste to have that fight be the last fight, when if they would have just done Tony versus Khabib before in March, it would have actually happened. Neither guy was injured. And what ended up happening is, I believe Khabib wasn't able to come to the US to fight, or Fight Island or wherever. So it was Tony Ferguson versus Justin Gaethje. And obviously Tony Ferguson lost. He never won a fight again, and this fight never ended up happening. Moving on to the last example, Francis Ngannou versus Jon Jones. This was a blockbuster fight after 2021 when Francis Ngannou knocked out Stipe. Everyone thought this is the guy to beat Jon Jones. Unfortunately, this didn't happen for a much more simple reason. Jones, he just took way too long to move up to heavyweight. I guess it takes, a long time to bulk up, especially to heavyweight. But to waste 3 years bulking up is just crazy. And on top of that, he knew that Francis Ngannou was going to leave eventually. He knew that after the Gane fight, he likely isn't going to move. He likely is going to leave the UFC. It was unfortunate. I don't know if either guy was really ducking each other. This would have helped the UFC so much. This was another massive fight that we missed out on. Hopefully we don't miss out on Tom Aspinall versus Jon Jones like we did with this fight. But this was very unfortunate. But yeah, let me know which fights I missed out on, which ones you disagree with. But yeah, that is it for me.